For years, my HOA drained my bank account with unfair fees, mysterious maintenance costs, and absurd fines for non-existent violations. I paid up until I stumbled upon a legal loophole buried in decades-old property records. Turns out, my house had a unique exemption, one the HOA never saw coming. As I dug deeper, I realized they weren't just overcharging me. They were scamming the entire neighborhood. With my discovery in hand, I had a choice: stay quiet and escape their grip, or expose their corruption for good. I chose war. I should have known from the start that something was off. When I first bought my house, the HOA representative was all smiles, assuring me that the fees were modest and necessary to maintain the high standards of our community. I nodded along, signing the paperwork without much thought. After all, I figured a little extra each month was worth living in a nice neighborhood. I was wrong. The first red flag came within a month of moving in. A violation notice taped to my front door in bright, aggressive red. Unauthorized lawn ornamentation. Fine, $50. I stared at the paper, confused, before glancing at my front yard. The only thing out of place was the small decorative bird bath my grandmother had gifted me, nestled among my flower beds. It had been there since day one. I shrugged it off, assuming it was a mistake, and sent a polite email asking for clarification. The reply came in record time. All exterior modifications must be HOA approved. Please remove non-compliant structures immediately or face additional fines. That was just the beginning. The next month, my dues suddenly increased by $30 with no explanation. When I asked about it, the HOA president, a perfectly manicured woman named Linda, smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. Inflation, she said smoothly, and of course, ongoing community improvements. Except there were no improvements. The sidewalks still had cracks, the playground equipment was rusting, and the community pool hadn't been open in 2 summers. Then came the mailbox fine, $200 for failure to comply with the neighborhood aesthetic. My mailbox, according to them, was off-white rather than the regulation HOA sandstone beige. I tried to fight it, but Linda simply flipped to a random page in the HOA handbook and tapped her French manicured nail against a vague rule about uniformity. "It's in the guidelines," she said with a shrug. "You should have read them." I learned quickly that reasoning with the HOA was pointless. Every attempt to challenge a fee was met with a condescending email citing obscure bylaws, or worse, a new violation notice arriving in my mailbox the very next day. By year 2, my fees had nearly doubled from what I originally agreed to, and the fines just kept coming. One for excessive holiday decorations, when I left my string lights up a day. Past New Year's, another for improper trash bin placement because my garbage cans were 6 inches too close to the curb. I was even fined once because the shade of my front door wasn't an approved neutral tone. It was navy blue. The worst part? I wasn't the only one suffering. I started talking to my neighbors, and everyone had the same horror stories. James, from 2 doors down, got fined for having a flower pot on his porch. Mrs. Patel, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade, was harassed for her overgrown lawn while she was recovering from surgery. It wasn't about maintaining a nice neighborhood. It was about control, and it was working. No one wanted to fight back. Those who did were slapped with lawsuit threats, liens on their homes, or, if they really made trouble, anonymous complaints to the city about safety violations. The HOA had turned into a dictatorship, and we were all paying for it. But at the time, I thought there was nothing I could do. So, like everyone else, I paid up. Until one day, I didn't. The notice was waiting for me, like a slap in the face, taped to my door in that all-too-familiar aggressive red. I didn't even have to read it to know what it was. Another fine? A new violation? No, this time it was worse. My monthly HOA fees were increasing. Again. The reason? Unforeseen administrative costs. I crumpled the paper in my fist, my blood boiling. Unforeseen costs? Like what? The same cracked sidewalks and broken streetlights that had been pending repair for 3 years. The community pool that was still closed for scheduled maintenance with no sign of work ever being done. Or maybe Linda needed a new round of Botox. Whatever it was, I wasn't paying another dime until I got some answers. I stormed into my house, tossing the notice onto my kitchen table as I grabbed my laptop. I had put up with this for too long. It was time to figure out exactly how deep this scam ran. I started where any sane person would, the HOA bylaws, a thick, convoluted, 150-page document filled with legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate. I scrolled through page after page of nonsense about grass height, exterior color schemes, and approved shrubbery, but nothing explained where all this money was actually going. Then I looked at the budget reports the HOA was required to provide. The numbers made no sense. Tens of thousands of dollars in miscellaneous expenses with no further breakdown. I kept digging. I scoured state laws on HOA regulations. I even went down an online rabbit hole of horror stories from people in other neighborhoods dealing with the same predatory nonsense. But it wasn't until I pulled out my own property deed that I found it, the one thing that changed everything. My house, along with a handful of others, had been part of the original development agreement before the HOA was even formed. Buried deep in legalese was a single line that made my heart race. Exempt from subsequent homeowners association governance unless voluntarily enrolled. My house wasn't supposed to be under HOA control. Not now, not ever. I had been paying them for years when I legally didn't have to. I sat back, the full weight of what I had just discovered settling over me. The HOA had no power over me. Every fine, every fee, every notice they had sent me had been nothing but fraud. Linda and her little army of rule enforcers had no idea. But they were about to find out. The more I read, the more my pulse pounded in my ears. I wasn't just free from the HOA's grasp. I had never been under their authority in the first place. The document was old, nearly crumbling at the edges, but it was ironclad. Decades ago, when the original developers first parceled out the land, a special zoning agreement had been written into the city's records. The properties in my section of the neighborhood had been sold under a different classification, separate from the HOA's eventual formation, which meant one thing: they had no legal right to charge me a single dime. I sat there, staring at the words, the reality of it all washing over me. Every ridiculous fine, every late fee, every fabricated charge Linda and her minions had ever squeezed out of me, it was all based on a lie. My stomach twisted as I mentally calculated how much money I had thrown into their greedy hands over the years. Thousands. And they owed me every single cent of it. I checked the city's public records next, just to be sure. My fingers flew across the keyboard, digging through archives, cross-referencing lot numbers and zoning distinctions. It all matched. My property, along with 7 others in the neighborhood, was listed under the original agreement. If any of my neighbors had been paying dues, they were being scammed too. I could hardly contain the mixture of rage and exhilaration flooding through me. This wasn't just some minor oversight. This was fraud. I pulled up my email, attaching copies of the documents to send to my lawyer. I wanted professional confirmation before I made my move, but in my gut, I already knew what the answer would be. The HOA had been illegally extorting me for years. I could walk away right now, never pay them another dime, and there was nothing they could do about it. Or I could take this further. I could demand every cent back. I could expose them. I could burn their entire operation to the ground. A slow smile spread across my face as I stared at the files on my screen. Linda had no idea what was coming. I spent the next few nights going through every single document the HOA had ever sent me. Every violation notice, every increase in dues, every unexplained charge. I lined them up on my kitchen table, sorting them into piles. The sheer volume was staggering. Late fees for bills I had paid on time. Maintenance charges for projects that never happened. Special assessments for beautification efforts that somehow never made it past Linda's personal landscaping company. The more I dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just incompetence. This was theft. I needed to see if it was just me. I started knocking on doors, carefully choosing which neighbors to approach. Most of them had the same exhausted look I had, the look of people who had been nickel and dimed into submission. Mrs. Patel showed me a fine she got for having her recycling bin visible from the street, while it was still waiting for pickup. James had been forced to pay for a fence repainting that the HOA claimed was mandatory, only to find out later that the entire project had been scrapped. The worst was Mr. Henderson, a retired veteran who had been hit with so many surprise fees that he had nearly lost his house. The patterns were undeniable. The HOA had been bleeding us dry for years, and no one had ever questioned it. Then I looked at the annual budget reports the HOA was legally required to provide. I had never paid much attention to them before, but now I went through every line with a fine-tooth comb. That's when I found it. Large amounts of money allocated to projects that didn't exist. $15,000 for a security upgrade that never happened. $22,000 for storm drain repairs when the city had already handled them at no cost. And then there was the big one, a $50,000 administrative cost with no explanation. The realization hit me like a freight train. The board members weren't just squeezing residents for extra cash. They were skimming money right off the top. I printed everything, made copies, and compiled a thick folder of evidence. This wasn't just a matter of getting my own money back anymore. This was about taking them down. And at the next HOA meeting, I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what was happening. The community center was packed. Word had spread fast that something big was happening at the HOA meeting, and I made sure to arrive early. I sat near the back, watching as Linda stood at the front of the room, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. She had no idea that tonight she was about to lose everything. As the meeting started, she went through the usual motions. Updates on upcoming neighborhood projects that would never happen, reminders about fine payments, and a thinly veiled threat about residents who weren't in compliance. That was my cue. I stood up. Actually, Linda, I have something to bring to the board's attention. She barely looked at me, probably expecting another complaint she could brush off. You'll need to submit any concerns in writing, she said, already moving on. I didn't sit down. Instead, I walked straight to the front of the room, pulling out a thick folder and placing it on the table in front of her. I already did, and I also sent it to my lawyer. That got her attention. I turned to face the crowd. For years, we've been told we're required to pay these increasing fees and fines, but that's not exactly true, is it? I pulled out a stack of copies and started handing them to the homeowners closest to me. Because according to this document, the original development agreement, certain properties in this neighborhood, including mine, are actually exempt from the HOA's control. The room fell silent. Linda grabbed one of the copies and skimmed it quickly. Her confident smirk started to crack. This is outdated. It's no longer valid. I shook my head. That's not what the city records say, and it's not what my lawyer says either. I let that sink in before continuing. Which means every dollar the HOA has taken from me was stolen, and now you owe me a refund. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People were flipping through the documents, whispering to each other. Some were checking their own property details, realizing they might be exempt too. Linda's face had gone pale. The other board members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They had just realized the scam was up, and I wasn't even close to being finished. Linda's hands shook as she clutched the documents, flipping through them like she could somehow make the words disappear. The silence that followed my announcement lasted only a second before the entire room exploded. "What do you mean some of us are exempt?" someone near the front demanded. "Does this apply to my house?" another voice called out. "This can't be right," one of the board members stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "The HOA was established decades ago. It applies to everyone." "It doesn't," I cut in, my voice steady. "These properties were never part of the HOA agreement. The board either didn't know or chose to ignore it. Either way, they've been illegally charging people for years." The murmurs turned into full-blown shouting. Homeowners grabbed at the papers, flipping through them desperately. I saw Mr. Henderson at the back, an older man who had almost lost his home to HOA fines, squinting at the list of exempt properties. "Holy hell," he muttered. "My house is on here." That was the match that set the whole thing ablaze. A woman named Denise, one of Linda's staunchest defenders, stood up and pointed at me. "This is ridiculous. You're twisting some ancient paperwork to get out of paying your fair share. The HOA has every right to enforce its rules." I smiled. "Funny you mention that, because the law says otherwise." I turned to the crowd. I had a lawyer go through everything. Not only am I legally exempt, but the HOA has no power over anyone on this list, which means that if you've been paying dues, fines, or fees, you've been scammed. Another wave of shouts broke out. Linda tried to calm things down, but it was useless. People were standing, arguing, demanding to see their own deeds, questioning how long they'd been cheated. Then she snapped, "Enough!" The room went silent. Linda took a deep breath, regaining some of her composure. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "If you think you can just waltz in here and make legal threats, you'll be in for a rude awakening. The HOA has lawyers too." I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough to make sure everyone was hanging on to every word. "Linda, I hate to break it to you, but you're the one in legal trouble now." For the first time since I had moved into this neighborhood, Linda looked afraid. Linda's fear was quickly replaced with desperation. She straightened her blouse, took a slow breath, and forced a tight-lipped smile. "Now, let's not be hasty," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "There's obviously been some confusion here. I'm sure we can work something out." The board members exchanged nervous glances. The smug arrogance they had always carried was gone. They weren't in control anymore, and they knew it. I crossed my arms. "Oh, I've already worked something out." I let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting them sink in. "I filed a complaint with the state's housing authority 2 days ago. They're investigating all of this." Linda's face lost what little color it had left. I could practically see the calculations running through her head, the frantic search for a way out. She opened her mouth, but before she could get a word in, Mr. Henderson spoke up. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "If they've been illegally collecting dues from people who were never supposed to be in the HOA, that means they have to give all that money back." You could have heard a pin drop. Then the room erupted again. "How much do they owe us?" someone shouted. "Years of dues? Fines? That's thousands of dollars." A man in the front row pulled out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. "I just checked," he muttered. "HOA fraud is criminal." Panic was spreading fast. Board members were whispering among themselves, their expressions shifting from confusion to outright fear. Linda slammed her hand on the table. "Enough!" Her voice cracked as she tried to regain control. "This is a misunderstanding. We will conduct a thorough review and—" I cut her off. "No, the state will conduct a review. And you know what else?" I pulled out another document from my folder. "I also filed a civil lawsuit for the money you stole from me." Linda inhaled sharply, and for the first time, she had nothing to say. The board had spent years bullying this neighborhood, using fear and bureaucracy to line their own pockets. But the moment someone fought back, the moment they were truly held accountable, they folded like a cheap lawn chair. And I wasn't done with them yet. The fallout was immediate. Within days of my bombshell at the meeting, the HOA board went into full-blown crisis mode. Emails started flying out, dripping with damage control. "We appreciate your patience during this review process. The board is committed to transparency. We assure you that all funds have been handled responsibly." But it was too late. The state's housing authority launched an official investigation, and the moment they started digging, the entire house of cards collapsed. They subpoenaed financial records, interviewed former board members, and within weeks, the truth came out. It was worse than I could have imagined. For years, the HOA had been running what was essentially a legalized scam. Homeowners were being charged for services that were never provided, fined for bogus violations, and strong-armed into paying special assessments that mysteriously disappeared. The biggest bombshell? Linda and the treasurer had been skimming money directly from the HOA's funds. Tens of thousands of dollars funneled into personal accounts under fake expense reports. When the news hit the neighborhood, it was like a dam broke. People who had been too scared to speak up before finally came forward. A retired couple revealed they had been threatened with foreclosure for unpaid fines that never should have existed. A single mother was forced to take out a loan because the HOA jacked up her fees so high she couldn't afford them. Even the community pool repairs, the ones that had never materialized, turned out to be a complete fabrication. The HOA was finished. Linda tried to save herself, of course. She issued a statement blaming clerical errors and miscommunications. She swore she had no idea about the missing money. But when the bank records came out, showing direct transfers from HOA funds to her personal account, her fate was sealed. She resigned that night. The board crumbled with her. One by one, members stepped down, trying to escape before the legal hammer came down. The housing authority forced the HOA to issue refunds to every homeowner who had been wrongly charged, myself included. I got back every cent they stole from me. But this was bigger than just my money. The entire HOA was dismantled. The ridiculous rules, the pointless fines, the suffocating control, it was all gone. And the best part? I made sure Linda was the last HOA president this neighborhood would ever have. The first thing I noticed after the HOA fell was the silence. Not the eerie kind, but the peaceful kind. The absence of passive-aggressive violation. Notices taped to doors, of early morning inspections where Linda paraded around with her clipboard, of whispered complaints about someone's trash bin being 1 inch too close to the curb. For the first time since I had moved in, the neighborhood actually felt like a neighborhood. People started talking to each other again, no longer afraid that a friendly chat on the sidewalk would turn into a lecture about HOA policies. Mr. Henderson, who had nearly lost his house to their endless fines, started sitting on his porch again, with a shade of mulch, or being told they couldn't paint their front door anything other than approved beige tones. With the excessive fees gone, the neighborhood became desirable again. One by one, the for sale signs that had been sitting in yards for months disappeared. Houses that had struggled to sell suddenly had bidding wars. People were excited to move in, and the ones who stayed, they started taking pride in their homes again. Not because some self-appointed overlord demanded it, but because they actually wanted to. Without the constant fear of fines, families put up swing sets for their kids. A group of neighbors got together and repainted the community benches and fences, something the HOA claimed there was never enough money for. The community pool, long abandoned under the excuse of pending repairs, was finally reopened after a local business pitched in to help. The transformation was night and day. And as I sat on my porch watching kids ride their bikes without worrying about some HOA busybody telling them they were too loud, I realized something. This was what the neighborhood was always supposed to be, not a place controlled by power-hungry board members with too much time on their hands. A home. The check from the HOA refund arrived in the mail like a trophy. It wasn't just about the money, it was about winning. Every fine they had ever slapped on me, every bogus fee they had forced me to pay, every dollar they had stolen was now back in my hands, and I knew exactly what to do with it. I was going to make sure the entire neighborhood celebrated their freedom. Within a week, plans were in motion. Flyers went out, texts were sent, and word spread fast. A block party, the first real community event in years, was happening. Not one of those stiff, HOA-sanctioned, approved gatherings with overpriced food trucks and a list of prohibited activities. This was going to be a party. No rules, no board members lurking around with their clipboards, no fines for unauthorized gatherings. Just food, music, and neighbors finally getting to enjoy their own community. The day of the party, I set up in the park that the HOA had neglected for years. The same park they had once claimed wasn't in the budget to maintain, even though we had all been paying for it. Now, thanks to some volunteers and a few donated supplies, it looked better than ever. People showed up in droves. Mr. Henderson manned the grill, flipping burgers like he was feeding an army. Mrs. Patel brought trays of homemade samosas that disappeared within minutes. Someone set up a speaker, blasting music that would have definitely been considered a noise violation under the old regime. Kids ran around laughing, playing soccer, riding bikes, without anyone telling them they were breaking some ridiculous HOA rule about excessive activity. And Linda? She was nowhere to be seen. People shared stories, real stories, about the harassment they had endured under the HOA. James talked about how he had been fined for parking in his own driveway. Mrs. Garcia, who had moved in just last year, admitted she had considered selling because the HOA made her feel like a prisoner in her own home. But now people felt free. As I stood there, watching neighbors bond over grilled hot dogs and shared grievances, I knew we had done something bigger than just getting rid of a corrupt HOA. We had taken back our community. The fallout came fast and hard. Within weeks, the investigation led to serious consequences for the former HOA board. Linda tried to disappear, but the state wasn't about to let her off that easy. The embezzlement charges alone were enough to bury her. But when the full extent of her fraud came to light, she had no choice but to lawyer up. The stolen funds, the fake expenses, the secret deals, it all came crashing down on her. She was forced to sell her house to cover legal fees, and last I heard, she had moved in with a distant cousin in another state. The same woman who had spent years controlling everyone's property was now homeless by her own doing. Other board members weren't so lucky. The treasurer, the one who had been helping Linda cook the books, was sued by multiple homeowners and was ordered to pay back thousands in restitution. A few others tried to play dumb, claiming they had no idea about the shady dealings, but when the financial records showed they had personally benefited from HOA funds, their excuses didn't hold up. Civil lawsuits started piling up. Homeowners who had been wrongfully fined took legal action, and the payout demands were astronomical. Some residents, like Mr. Henderson, had almost lost their homes over fraudulent fees. Others, like Mrs. Garcia, had been forced to pay thousands in special assessments that never went to anything real. Now they wanted justice. And then there was me. I never set out to be anyone's hero, but somehow that's exactly what I became. People started calling me the guy who took down the HOA. At the grocery store, neighbors would shake my hand. At the coffee shop, someone would buy my drink and just say, "Thanks for what you did." Even local news outlets picked up the story. Homeowner exposes HOA, corruption, and wins big. My face was on TV for the first time in my life, and I barely knew what to do with myself. I didn't mind the attention, but what I loved the most was seeing the neighborhood finally at peace. No more threats, no more ridiculous fees, no more walking on eggshells in our own homes. Linda and her cronies had spent years making everyone's life miserable. Now, they were the ones paying the price. Life without the HOA felt surreal. No more letters taped to my door. No more waking up to fines for nonsense infractions. No more feeling like a prisoner in my own home. I could park where I wanted, decorate how I pleased, and live without fear of some power-hungry board member telling me I was doing it wrong. It felt free. But the strangest part? It had all come down to a single loophole. A paragraph buried in decades-old paperwork, overlooked or ignored, that had unraveled an entire corrupt empire. The HOA had spent years convincing people they had absolute authority, that their word was law, that fighting them was useless. But the moment someone questioned them, they folded like cheap lawn furniture. That was what stuck with me the most. It was never about legality. It was about control. They thrived on people blindly following the rules, too intimidated to push back. They used fear, threats of fines, liens, even lawsuits to keep homeowners obedient. And for a long time, it worked, until it didn't. That was the real lesson in all of this. Never assume authority is absolute. Never assume the rules are fair just because someone in charge says they are. And most importantly, never stop asking questions. After everything that happened, I started wondering how many other neighborhoods were dealing with the same scam. How many other HOAs were padding their own pockets, inventing rules on the fly, and scaring homeowners into paying fees they didn't actually owe. And how many of them had a loophole hiding in plain sight, just waiting for someone to find it. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted to start looking. For now, though, I was enjoying my victory. My home was truly mine again, no longer under the control of a bunch of busybodies with too much time on their hands. My neighbors were happy. The street was alive again. And most importantly, we had taken something back that we should have never lost in the first place, the right to live in our own homes without fear. As I sat on my porch, sipping a cold drink and watching the sunset, I couldn't help but grin. The HOA had ruled this neighborhood for years, and in the end, it only took one person asking the right question to bring them down.